Hi, my name is Jodi Duryea, and I am a chef and a principal lecturer here at the University of North Texas. I work in the Hospitality and Tourism Department in the College of Merchandising and Hospitality Management. So I'm going to start with a little of my background because I don't come to academics in the normal way. So I grew up, I'm from upstate New York, and I grew up in the city. I lived in New York City for 20 years before moving to Texas. And I grew up in a family that was very artsy. My mother was an actor, my father was a musician, my brother was an artist, my sister was a dancer, and basically my takeaway from that was I really want a job with a regular paycheck. And so I was still creative, but I wanted to be able to make a living. So, and I loved cooking, and almost everyone in my family cooks, and we're very creative. My mother, was back in the days when you made dinner every night, and it was never the same meal. And when we loved something she made, she'd be like, I don't remember what I did. And my father was a great cook, and my brother ended up with a farm, and he was a great cook. My sister didn't love cooking, but she worked in restaurants for years. So I decided I wanted to become a chef. My family was very against this idea because they had all worked in restaurants, and my parents had actually even owned a restaurant. And they knew how hard it was. But so I did go for my bachelor's. I ended up being a history major, and I do love history, and I took a lot of literature classes, and I got a really great, well-rounded background in everything. And during that time, I also got to do study abroad. So I encourage anybody that has the opportunity to study abroad to do it, because it really just makes such a huge difference in how you look at the world and your experiences. So I studied abroad, and I went to England, and I lucked out because at that time England was just really a pit in terms of culinary. But I happened to live with a family that were amazing. The woman was a wonderful cook, and she was a wonderful traditional English cook. And she really put a whole new light on what traditional English cooking is. And then I lived with I rented a room from another woman, and she was an editor, and she had a wonderful French cooking background. And I got to travel all over Europe, and it just reinforced how much I loved food and cooking. So when I graduated with my bachelor's, I was still kind of like, what do I do? And I ended up getting I got a job overseas teaching English, and it was in Indonesia. And that's where I was like, I love food, I want to cook. I spent almost all my free time watching the cook in the place prepare the meals. I just loved it. And so when I got back to the States after trying a couple other things, I ended up starting to work in kitchens. And it was really hard work. It was when there were hardly any women in the kitchen. And I got to experience a lot of things, good and bad, that really shaped my view of food and cooking. I got to work with people from all over the world as New York City, and so the kitchens were just full of all different immigrants. And we would have family meals and specials in the restaurant, and they would always involve something from someone, and it just really reinforced it. So I ended up going to the Culinary Institute of America. By far the best decision I've ever made. I loved CIA. It was a total immersion in food and cooking. It was, again, in my class of 18, there's only one other woman, and so it was definitely a man's world, but I just loved my 2 years there. And then I started cooking. I went back. I worked through the whole time, and I went into restaurants in New York City, and I traveled a little. I ended up living in a couple other places. I worked in Virginia. I worked in Pittsburgh. I loved cooking. I loved being a chef. I eventually worked my way up to being a chef. What they don't tell you in those food shows is how physically demanding cooking full-time is. And so I ended up down in Texas for a job, and my body was really starting to have repercussions to the long, 12, 14 hours on your feet, very, very physical work. And so I got the opportunity to start teaching at Del Mar College, and I started their pastry program. I've always done both culinary and pastry. I love both areas. And with that, I ended up going for my master's, and I got my master's in technical education. And what I loved about getting my master's was learning about how to evaluate research, because I think there's so many, especially in my area of food and nutrition, there's so many fads that can easily make you think, I have to cut all of this food group out of my life. And so there's so much research, and there's so many studies that show so many different things that really oppose each other. And so one of the things about learning about research and how to read research that has been so helpful is that I can now evaluate whether these are valid concepts, if these are just the beginning of something, if these are things to consider in my own life and in what I'm teaching. So with that, from there, I ended up here at the University of North Texas, and while I don't do traditional research, I am involved with a group called MCURC, and that's Menus of Change Research Collaborative, University Research Collaborative. And they're a group, they were started by the Culinary Institute of America and Harvard and Stanford. And they got together and they said, if we work with our dining services, we can possibly influence our students to make better choices in their diet. And they started with 25, and University of North Texas was one of the first people invited to join, because we had just opened our first vegan cafeteria. And what we soon found out, whether we were dining services or in research or in academics, is that there was very little communication between these two groups. And once we started meeting and talking, dining services here at University of North Texas has really embraced the research collaborative and what we're doing and what they're providing for you in the cafeterias. Every cafeteria has a vegan line, every cafeteria has vegetarian options. You may not realize this, but when you go for your plate, they're trying to give you, you have options, of course, and some students I see when I go to the cafeteria still choose chicken fingers, fried chicken fingers, French fries, and mashed potatoes. But if you want, you have the choice of having half your plate with vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, a small proper portion of protein, and a small portion of whole grain starch. And this is a drastic change in what you would get from a cafeteria even 5 years ago. So, and now we have our new cafeteria that has eliminated the 7 main allergens. It's a huge challenge when you're putting together dining services. So what do I do? And so what I've done also in my classes, so what I teach are professional food preparation, which is a basic cooking class, and we go through everything from how do you wash dishes properly, how do you hold a knife, how do you cut things efficiently, to making your own mayonnaise, to making how to cut up a chicken, how to cook meat properly, how to make yeast breads and quick breads. So the whole gamut of food. And I try to introduce everything, small amounts of everything to people. I also have designed our meals, what we're cooking, to embrace the principles of menus of change, which are mostly vegetables on the plate, a small amount of whole grains, and a healthy protein. So I'm not vegetarian myself. I eat a surprising amount of vegetables and whole grains, and I try to make them taste good. And so what most students come away from, they start this class going, yeah, I should eat more vegetables, but I just don't like them. And when they have an open mind, they're like, oh, these are delicious. You know, one of the first things we make is like a spinach souffle, and they're like, oh, I don't like spinach, or I don't like mushrooms. And they're like, oh, that was really good. And at the end of class, I always have at least 5 or 6 students say how much they loved the mushroom souffle, even though they don't like mushrooms. And so these are ways of just kind of broadening your minds, and hopefully when you leave the class, you'll start cooking a more well-balanced meal. The other classes I teach are Global Kitchens, which is just, I think, one of the best class offered at UNT. And it is, we cook from around the world, and every week is a different area of the world. And the big group project is that you lead the class, you choose an area of the globe, and you design the menu and the presentation and the lecture and the PowerPoints and the market order. And then when we're cooking, you go around and you guide the students in their different dishes. And it's I think one of the best classes here. And then we just started last spring, which kind of got interrupted with COVID, a beginning baking class. So those are some options, and you do not have to be a major to take any of the classes, but you do have to take food preparation before you can take the other 2 classes. Just so I'm not teaching you how to hold a knife, hopefully, when you get in. What else do you do? So one of my areas that I've really been delving into in the last couple of years is sourdoughs and fermentation and whole grains. So I do a lot. I've been baking and exploring how to make breads that are lighter and fluffier, still have some texture to them, but are whole grain and not white flour. Because I think that whole grains are just so much better for you. So that is my area of expertise and what I love to do. One of the things that gives me great pleasure is creating new recipes, putting together new dishes, incorporating the different spices and flavors from around the world into things that are traditionally made here. And I really love sharing that with my students. And so research doesn't always look like a dry statistical document. It can also be, what bread did I make today? So thank you so much for your time. I really hope you enjoy your time at UNT, and I look forward to maybe seeing you in my class.